everyone. Welcome to another Coffee and Hardtack, a digital engagement with the Civil War Museum in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where we interview different Civil War historians and educators. My name is Jenn Edginton. I'm Curator of Education at the Kenosha Museum campus, which includes the Civil War Museum. And with me, as always, is Doug Dammann, who is the manager of the Education Department and the curator of the Civil War Museum. We are very excited for our next guest. So I'm really happy. Thank you for joining us, Richard Heisler. We're so excited.
Good to be here.
Perfect.
Hi.
Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, my name's Richard Heisler. I live in Seattle, Washington. And what I'm working on, and the reason that we're here today, is I have a project that I've started and ongoing that's called Seattle Civil War Legacy. And right now it's primarily runs off of my Facebook page. And what the project is sort of compiling a history of Seattle veterans from the Civil War, Union veterans primarily, but some Confederates, former enslaved, they wound up here after the Civil War. I guess I'm not sure what much else to say about it than that, but that's the project is sort of compiling history and bringing awareness to and educating people on this sort of not hidden but forgotten history, I guess, of the veterans that came here and literally built this city in many cases after the war, and it's a passion project, and hopefully it's continues to build and expand and yeah. So
Richard, how did you become interested in this project? I think for most of the people here, it's a stretch to have a museum about the Civil War in Kenosha, Wisconsin.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
You know, don't think about Seattle and Civil War history. So how did you come to be interested in this?
Well, I mean, personally, I became interested in this period of history as a child, pretty much out of the womb. I grew up in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and we spent a lot of time in battlefields in Virginia. My dad was very, very interested in history, my mother as well. So I moved here to Seattle in 1991, so I guess I've been here almost 30 years, and have always continued to study the war, my whole time, even through, I went to art school, I studied art, but I was really interested in historical illustration, and I took as many history classes as the art school offered, which weren't many. So I've always been interested in, yet it was only like recently that I really started appreciating the soldiers that are buried here. I used to do reenacting like a lot of people did in the late 90s, which was kind of the heyday of reenacting. And we would go on Veterans Day, we'd go to the cemetery, 5 or 6 of us would go, and we'd fire a little salute with the things and, act like we were saying something important and worthwhile. But it never occurred to me like, wow, who are these guys? And it was just, they were just there, and there wasn't much to it. And I have an ancestor, my 3rd great-grandfather, who he fought in a New York regiment. And one day I went to visit that cemetery because I knew there was a couple soldiers that had been in his regiment. And I wanted to find out a little bit more about them. So I started looking into their particular stories of these guys, not just, oh, there's a monument and there's a lot of graves and there's some Civil War, soldiers here. It was like, who is this guy? And I found that he was wounded at Fredericksburg within, I'm going to estimate, about 150 yards or so of where my great-grandfather was wounded. And from that point, it became kind of personal, like, wow, these guys were laying on the ground together in the slaughter pen, in the mud at Fredericksburg, not dead, fortunately, but wounded. And they probably went to the same hospital, and they probably followed, a similar course for a while. And eventually those two, my ancestor was in the 83rd New York, and this fellow was in the 97th New York. And those two regiments were consolidated at kind of mid Overland campaign, June of '64. So I was like, wow, these guys they must have contacted each other at some point, whether they knew each other or not, conversations, who knows? But they were there, at the same time. And then I started look. There's a couple other guys from that same regiment that are buried within, I don't know, 5 yards of each other. And I was like, well, did they come here together? How? There's 3 guys. There's a lot of diversity among the veterans here, but there's not many groups of guys from similar regiments that stood out. And I thought, wow, look at these 3 97th New York soldiers buried all within the same vicinity here. Did they know each other? Did they wind up here? Did they come here together? Did they work together? They weren't family, but like how are they here together? And that's what made me sort of look into like, how did they get here? What were they doing here? Why did they come when they came? And then I started looking like, wow, there's in this Grand Army of the Republic cemetery, there's 510, I think, roughly. There's 526, I think, total, but there's some wives. And so I think it's about 505 or 510. And I was like, wow, these guys all have something like this. And then I started looking at other cemeteries, and the door got kicked open. And I realized the scope of the guys here, and just start one by one, started looking at who they were, and then started looking at patterns and what states were these guys from, or what different things that would sort of tell the story, because they all came at that same time, and they came almost as a large group. So it suddenly was like, wow, there's something here. And I started looking into information about it, and I just it didn't seem like anybody had done much more beyond genealogy and short biographies of some of them. That was about as much as I could find. So that's how it started. It was just like it accelerated quickly from looking up the one soldier and like, wow, I wonder if they were in the same hospital together, to holy cow, there's close to 2,000 men in this county in Seattle that were buried here, and many that went elsewhere too after they lived here. And it was just put in my lap, like all of a sudden, here we go.
That's so amazing. That's really, really cool. So kind of a follow-up on that. So veterans of the Civil War moved in large numbers to the Pacific Northwest, like you're talking about. Yeah. After the war, of course. So have you found any patterns or reasons that these men were moving out there after the war?
Yeah. And that's almost what's most interesting about this, because the war history and the battle history, there's some exceptional stories with men here. But they're no more exceptional than people that are buried in the famous cemetery in Chicago, or in Greenwood in New York, or on the battlefields. That aspect of it's not so different. But the pattern of how they wound up here, and it's completely hand in hand with the history of Seattle itself. Seattle, the original settlers came to Seattle in 1851. So relatively speaking, it's a very new place. And the city was really slow to develop. And it really wasn't until the 1883, you start seeing more numbers of them showing up in 1886 and on, after the railroad made it. They could get here by railroad from the 1870s via Portland, and then later it was Tacoma, and then eventually they could come straight to Seattle. But what happened with a lot of these guys is that they didn't come directly from Wisconsin and Illinois and Indiana or New York. They had the vast majority of them had homesteaded or moved west prior to this. So it goes, there's the original, go west young men, sort of post-war migration west, but that took them to Kansas and Nebraska and Iowa and Minnesota. And some of the New Yorkers and the Pennsylvania soldiers went to Michigan and Illinois first. Then some of them would go to South Dakota or North Dakota, and then they would come to Seattle, because there was nothing here before that. But they were already kind of moving. Somebody suggested, and this is something I really want to do, is how many of them were second or third born sons that didn't inherit anything in in Wisconsin where their family farm was, so they had to go, or they took advantage of homesteading. So it was like a staged migration here. So by the time that they had already set up a life in Minnesota on a farm, or in Kansas or Nebraska, and they had families, then Seattle sort of popped up. So they couldn't come here in the beginning. Some of them did. There's a few that came really early on that were like pioneers, and they were doing logging and that kind of stuff. But mostly they came here when the city happened, and that was 25 years after the war. So they had already migrated and already started this process, and then Seattle was sort of the development of Seattle was what was the culmination of their movement all the way across. And a lot of them were multiple cities. You look at the censuses, and 1870 they would still be in Wisconsin, in 1880 they'd be in Kansas, in 1890 they were in Seattle, and different cities in each of those states along the way. And so that was striking to me, is that people would say, oh, of course they came west, the westward expansion, and it was like, no, they didn't just come here after the war. They came here as part of that sort of urban migration of the Gilded Age, when Chicago doubled its population at the same time that Seattle blew up, to all the people were leaving the struggling farms, and these Kansas farmsteads were there flipping sod, trying to make a go of it. And then industry and investment capitalism was going in the cities, and so it parallels a lot of those historic trends in American history at that time as well. It's just, it wasn't like they were restless old veterans and they wanted an adventure and they moved west. They had already done that before they wound up in Seattle.
Richard, to that effect, do you have any a specific story or two that you can share with us about a veteran from the Upper Midwest?
Yeah.
From served in a Wisconsin regiment or an Illinois regiment. I know you've been working with the Milwaukee Civil War Roundtable on a project there in Seattle. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about maybe that soldier or the project that you're working on in conjunction with the Roundtable?
Yeah, sure. So the Roundtable project, so that involves a specific soldier named John Marshall Hoyt. He was a captain in the 7th Wisconsin, I believe it was Company K. I don't have a note in front of me. And as part of the research on, tracking, the first thing I had to do is make a list, basically, of all the guys. What cemeteries are they in? What are their names? What regiments were they in? And I discovered one day going to the cemetery that I couldn't find this soldier. Long story short, he does not have a headstone. He's buried unmarked in the Seattle cemetery. I confirmed at the cemetery, blah, 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 and I was like, well, let's look into the process of getting a VA headstone, a proper veteran's headstone for this guy. He's an officer in the Iron Brigade. He's got to be the only one out there that lies in an unmarked grave. So we should correct this situation. And it's a private cemetery that requires a substantial payment for the permanent care endowment for the grave. So we had to do some fundraising, and when I put it out on Facebook and started getting the word spread, the Milwaukee Roundtable found out about it, and they contacted me and said, "This is the kind of thing we want to do. This is why we save our pennies, is for this kind of project." So they very, very kindly paid the vast majority of the fee, which was almost $1,000, for the care for this headstone. So we got that taken care of, had the application in, which is currently where we're at in the process. So so that was neat. And Hoyt, he's, there's viewers you have that know 1,000 times more about him in his military service than I will ever know, with being an Iron Brigade officer. But after the war, he followed a classic pattern. He was a farmer in Nebraska for, I want to say, until the early 1900s, and his children had moved here to for work. I think one son was an attorney, The two of his sons may have been attorneys. So when he reached retirement age, he came to Seattle and he lived his final 10 or 15 years in Seattle and passed away here with his wife. So that's how he wound up here. He wasn't really a Seattle guy. He was just retired and came to live with his kids, and he happened to, be buried in Seattle. And interestingly, he's a short distance away from Colonel Holland Richardson in the same cemetery. So there's two Iron Brigade officers within, a pitching wedge shot of one another in this cemetery. So it's kind of neat, the connections and the small world that it becomes when you start looking around. But the stories of the other guys they're endless and they're fascinating. A lot of them came here and they worked sort of, I would say they didn't come here and build and dig ditches and cut trees and work in the mines. The majority of them, like 80+%, were sort of middle class, blue collar, white collar type jobs. So they came here and they were harness makers or machine shop owners or printers or a lot of attorneys and physicians. But my favorite one is there's a guy who's in the 13th Michigan. And I just found out about this fellow recently. His name is Erastus Finn. He fought at Chickamauga. He was wounded. He actually had a lower leg amputated at the battle. I'm still kind of trying to track down the real time specifics. I know which hospital he was at and that kind of stuff. So I'm still piecing together his military story. But after the war, he did the same thing. He farmed. He came to Washington pretty early in the 1870s. Actually, he was a farmer in eastern Washington by Spokane, and he eventually wound up here as a teamster, driving. I guess before cars got you around the city, they had horse and carriage. And he had a brother in Oregon, and apparently the two of them grew up with Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, on the Mississippi River. And Finn was the last name of this soldier. So his brother apparently is supposedly the Huckleberry Finn. They both fought in the war. It was when this soldier died, it was national news. It's in papers from Seattle to Boston and everywhere in between that I think he was 96 years old when he died, in 1930, 31, something like that. And it was a national story because it was the last of the Tom Sawyer gang, they would say, to pass away. And there was a Boston paper that refuted it and said, Mark Twain in his autobiography said that the character of Huckleberry Finn was based on this other guy, and it wasn't Erastus Finn's brother. His brother was a notorious teller of tall tales in Oregon, apparently. So it kind of undercut the credibility of the story a bit. But the obituary and the biographies of Erastus, who lived in Seattle, say that he, for years in his old age, would just sit and tell tales of times on the river with Mark Twain and Tom Sawyer. And it's, what a life to have lost the leg at Chickamauga and then been a homestead farmer without a leg in eastern Washington, growing wheat in the high desert country with, no irrigation and no tractors and whatever. And then to wind up in Seattle with your family and then, become national news when you die because of who your brother is supposed to have been. There's 1,000 stories like that. There's guys that were Indian fighters. There's an Illinois soldier who, after the war, went west. He stayed in the army or re-enlisted in a regular infantry unit or cavalry, I forget, and fought Indians. And he became a vaudeville performer. And his whole act was based on doing accents, comedic versions of different accents. And he did that for years. And it's just, the more you look, the more you find stories of these guys that did incredible things in the Civil War, and then had very noteworthy and interesting lives otherwise. And you combine the two, and then you put the unusualness of the fact that they all wound up here. And yeah, it's good stuff. I could tell stories like this for hours and hours and hours. And that's what I hope to do is with this project, I guess, is to do stuff like this and more speaking and more posts short posts on Facebook, that people can read without getting too long and wordy. Because it's and then eventually books and things to tie all this together. But the stories they're endless. They're absolutely endless. And then there's the Confederates, and then there's the former slaves, and so there's so much history that they brought with them and continued to make while they were here.
And that's kind of a good segue for my next question. And you mentioned it very briefly, but what's next for your project? What do you want to do next?
Well, what I'd like to do next is as this is organized. Most of what I have done, sort of in a public history sense, has been through is the work through Facebook and the posting, and what I've found has been a really big audience for that is regional history groups. Histories of Puget Sound region or Seattle, like those. That's been a really good audience for this. But I hope to expand it more like this. Like when I first talked to Doug, and we just realized, wow, there's literally 1,000 plus veterans from that region that are here. I hope to expand the audience to kind of a more national base. I'd like to do more stuff like this, more video and more speaking, because there's so much information with these guys that my ability to write it and get it out lags so far behind what I actually know, what I actually have on paper. So I'm hoping to do more like this. And then eventually, perhaps a standalone website. I don't find that the website would probably draw much more traffic than what we get through things like platforms like Facebook right now, because it's a one-stop shopping for people on Facebook, so they can go to your museum and they can go to the other history thing and then they can get my stuff all at the same time. So I'll probably internet-wise still stay focused on that, and then books. I'd really like to work on an overall book. I think the Union veterans, some of the themes that developed have pointed me in the direction of like worthwhile things, just focusing on guys from certain regiments, Western theater soldiers that did certain things here. You could write a whole book on the work that men did in the legal field, whether it was attorneys or Supreme Court justices, Superior Court clerks and justices that all came, that were all veterans that formed, things like women's voting in Washington, that was influenced by veterans. The Confederates would make their own subject, the formerly enslaved that came here, which is a daunting subject to even. I've been really hesitant to dip my toe in that water because that's not my specialty, but it's so significant. We have U.S. CT troops that were here, and just a lot that when you look at the censuses that were born in the 1840s and 1850s in Georgia and Tennessee and Mississippi, that you assume, you don't have proof, but you assume that they were enslaved at some point. All that stuff, it's you can't find much information about it in a concise format. It's there, it's scattered. There's little bits and pieces and books here and there, but nothing that ties it together. And that's what I hope to do going forward, is to really like group this stuff into something meaningful, where you can go and you can read about it, or you can watch videos about it and get that as the focus, not as a part of some other larger history.
Well, Richard, we thank you so much for sharing your research with us today and enlightening our viewers on maybe a geographic area that they had not considered as being a hotbed of Civil War activity. And we look forward to the next step and staying in touch as your research develops throughout.
Yeah, absolutely.
Next year.
Yeah, I'm thankful for you guys having me on. I'm glad to be able to present this, and hopefully in the future, yeah, it'd be nice to tie more of these specific stories to your museum, and even collections. I would be willing to bet that there's things that you have in your collections of guys that lived in Seattle, and it'd be fun to work together at some point to tell those stories as well.
Very good.
All right, thanks guys.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you for watching.